Okay, welcome back after lunch, everybody. Our next speaker is Anke Snoek from Amsterdam University. We'll be talking about a three-layered model to assess the loss of self-control in addiction. Over to you, Anke.
Thanks. Welcome, everybody. So I'm Anke Snoek. I'm now working at Amsterdam University Medical Center, but I did my master at the University of Humanistic Studies, and then I did my PhD at Macquarie University in Sydney. So I'm mostly presenting on the work that I did there, on the study that we did there. And the idea of the study was to look at how people with addiction, and mostly alcohol and opiate addiction, how they viewed their self-control. What did get in the way of the self-control? What did they wanted in life? What were their goals? And to compare their ideas with the models that were out there about addiction and self-control. So I basically did a narrative study. Like I asked them, a qualitative study. I asked them about their life stories, about their plans for next year. And I followed them up every year to see what happened in their lives. How did they got on with fulfilling their plans? What got in the way? Did their plans change and why? So that's what I will be talking about today. And I developed a three-layer model to assess loss of self-control in addiction based on the data and philosophical, neuroscientific, behavioral economic theories. Yes. So one of the quotes that I really like was from someone who said, "I hate the idea that addicts don't have control over their behavior, but why am I doing the same thing, taking drugs, over and over again when I know it's not in my favor?" So I think that's a way of expressing the puzzle of addiction that Hannah is writing about as well. And like a lot of people said that, I hate the idea that I don't have control, but at the same time, I'm not really happy about how my life is turning out. So what's happening? And loss of self-control and addiction, it's both like self-evident. If you talk about addiction, everyone kind of thinks, oh, loss of self-control. But if you look at the literature, you see that it's also a very complex concept. And what makes it so complex is that addictive behavior has both voluntary as involuntary aspects, as you can see in the quote as well. Person expressed, look, I have voluntary behavior, but not entirely. So quickly on the study. So it was a qualitative longitudinal study. I started with 69 people, couldn't find them back, all 69 over the past years. A lot of them were homeless, but I had a group of like 24 that I had regular contact with over the years. Mostly alcohol and opiate addiction, a few amphetamine users, but mostly a mix of substances. So 4 interviews over 3.5 years. Did a timeline interview in questions about plans for the future, perceived identity, control over life. Mostly were male, some female, a wide age range. So what I will be talking about today is I will start very briefly about the basic theories out there about how addiction affects self-control. And then I will make an argument that what makes it hard to compare these theories is that they have slightly different ideas about what self-control is and when behavior is self-controlled. So I will then look at more philosophical theories about what self-control is. And then I will present a case study that shows how the different elements of self-control come back in a real life case of addiction. And I end with recommendations. So very dominant in the last years have been the neurobiological model. I'm not sure what your background is, so how extensive I will discuss that. But basically they say addiction is a kind of overfueling of a normal reward system. So we'll have a reward system And normally, if we do behavior that's beneficial for us, for our procreation, for our lives, like eat high-calorie food, bonding, we experience pleasure and we get conditioned learning, so we're more efficient at guiding to those behaviors. And in addiction, there's like a lot of dopamine released, or if you use addictive substances, and that system gets deregulated and we start to chase things that are not that beneficial for our survival, but our system tells us they are. So we have strong craving, strong conditioned learning. It starts with strong pleasure. And this can result in almost compulsive behavior after long-term substance use. Then you have more the behavioral economic theories, and it says, look, we have to distinguish between short-term strategies in life and long-term strategies. And if you look at the short term on a daily basis, it's always more beneficial to use drugs than don't use drugs. Because if you use drugs, you'll have more pleasure, you will have good experience, you will perform better. But in the long run, you get more withdrawal, the effects will lessen, and you get serious side effects or health problems. So in the long run, it's not beneficial. But in the short run, if you have to decide, do I want to have a day full of craving and withdrawal, or do I want to feel good? It's always more beneficial to feel good. So what kind of people become addicted? There are people with short-term views in life. And whether we have a short-term or long-term view in life depends on a lot of factors. So mostly people get addicted in adolescence because that is a period where, due to brain changes, we tend to have more high-risk behavior, and we have to more short-term view on life, and we want to explore what's out there and not think about a future. So it's a developmental stage where we try new things, where we risk things. And it's very logical to use drugs then. And the maturing out theory says, but at a certain moment, these people turn 30, and they think, oh, there's more in life, they're partying, I want a family, I want a career. And they just stop using drugs without treatment. And another situation is like poverty or low socioeconomic backgrounds. If you're not sure if you have food on the table tomorrow, or if you're afraid you will get robbed, it's better to spend your money that day. So if you come from, like there are studies, if you come from poor socioeconomic backgrounds, it's more beneficial to have a short-term vision and to get most out of life and to get most out of your resources while you have them, and not to invest in the future. So those are people who get addicted. And then you have like the moralistic and liberal theories. And they say, well, the simplest explanation for behavior is people do the things they like. They like using drugs. That's why they use them. And the moralistic view says, look, they're bad people for doing this. And the liberal theory says we have put a stigma on this kind of pleasure-oriented behavior, but not on others. And it's quite unfair. And people with addiction suffer more from the stigma of society, but as pleasure-oriented behavior, there's really nothing wrong with using drugs. So how do we compare these theories? Because they all have like empirical and conceptual underpinnings that seem to be sound for some group of addictions or some group of people with addictions. But what I was looking at is that when in the different theories does behavior count as self-controlled? And when we look at the more normative philosophy about self-control, it says, look, there are three types of self-control. And the first is intentional. Like I have an intention to do something, can I follow that up? And it's often kind of short term. So I plan not to drink this night. And I end up drinking or not. Can I follow through with that intention? And often it says, look, we have intentional goals. They are mostly connected to instrumental goals, like we want to reach certain goals, and for that we have to regulate our behavior over a longer period of time in order to reach that goal. So if we want to succeed in our studies, we have to create a habit of studying over a longer time and not decide every evening whether I'm going to study or not. And if you want to reach abstinence, you have to work to that through different steps. And the last form of self-control is normative self-control. And it means more living according to your values, your ideal values, and your identity. And this is like it's about the self in self-control. And how I perceive myself as a person also determines what kind of things I find logical in life for me, what kind of options are open for me. So there's this one example of a smoker, and he drives to school to pick up his kids, pouring rain. He comes in the street, he sees his children standing in the rain, and at that moment he noticed, oh, I'm out of cigarettes. He makes a U-turn to buy cigarettes, and at that moment he thinks, I don't want to be the kind of person leaving my children out there in the rain for cigarettes. And that was kind of an awakening moment. And he quits using cigarettes, and he said, never had a problem stopping, just clicked. Oh, I became this person that does this kind of thing. I don't want to be that. So that's not an option for me anymore. And I think in the AA literature, there's this concept, fake it till you make it. Pretend that you're a non-drug user, what would you do? And you kind of adopt this desired identity and you try to act it out until it feels normal. So I'm not, if I wake up, it's not the first thing that I think, oh, I need to smoke a cigarette. But for a lot of smokers, it is. So try to adopt this identity. And what's mostly thought, let's see, is that they just logically follow. If you're able to follow your intentions, you're able to reach your goals. And those long-term goals we have in life, they constitute our agency, so they form us as a person. So it's kind of a hierarchy, bottom up. And it's often suggested that people with addiction, they lose control of that intentional part. They're not able to control their drug use, so they're not reaching their goals, so their identity is disturbed. So we have to focus on the intentional level, and the rest will follow automatically. So here are two examples like of intentional control. Do I get a beer or do I drive home safely? And the famous picture of Odysseus, that he has this goal of returning to his wife and son after the Trojan War. And he has to pass the sirens, and he knows he will not be able to control himself. So he ties himself to the mast of the ship in order to reach his goal. And like a lot of people with addiction use this kind of strategies, like no access to their money, or like betting with other persons that they can stay clean to kind of ensure that they reach goals. So this is the normative self-control, how our self-image influence our behavior. And are we able to live the life we want to live and be the person we value being? And so these three levels, they're not independent, they influence each other. But I think what the study will show is that there's not one right way to, to access that, but we need to look at all the three levels to assess whether self-control and addiction is impaired or not. And recovery can happen both bottom-up as top-down. But I think what's important for healthcare professionals is to realize that all three levels need to be addressed. And what we often see is that the normative level is not addressed that much, or it's kind of underrated, the influence of that and of people's self-concept on their behavior and on whether they exercise the self-control they might have. And it also shows that, like often people say, look, people with addiction like some people with addiction says, I gave up on the other levels and I just want to use drugs because I don't believe these other levels are available to me. And then people say, look, they have self-control, they're doing what they want to use drugs. But is that really a choice, or is that the only choice they think is available to them? And like you could also have like instrumental goals that are not your own, so you can reach your instrumental goals, but they still don't feel like your own goals. For example, if you're following with a career that your parents picked for you. And so then you have instrumental agency, but you don't have normative agency. So it really asks for a more elaborate approach of what self-control is and when is it lost. Is it when like all three levels, when it's lost on all three levels, or when it's only on one level? So this was one of the case studies for my respondents. It was a woman in my age, in her 30s then, early 30s, when I first interviewed her. And so she told me about how her drug use started. She said, well, in adolescence, I was lonely, a bit anxious. I was at a private school. I was doing reasonably well. Was diagnosed with ADD. I had Ritalin. I started experimenting a bit with my meds, also with alcohol, make me feel good, make me feel relaxed, make me feel less lonely. But I always kind of used alone in my room. But I come from a very stable upbringing, good family, siblings all doing well. She had very loving parents that really supported her, helped her through the way. And after high school, she started training as a nurse. She really liked that. She really enjoyed being a nurse. But she had also access to morphine and pethidine, so both opiates. And she said, well, I just started experimenting with them. I got caught. I lost my job, lost my place to live, got on the streets, started using ice, crystal meth, and things went pretty down from there. And then she seemed like a classical example of maturing out. She got pregnant, boyfriend left, was not in the picture. Her parents stepped in and said, look, you can live with us, get clean. She had a baby, and she said it was such a great experience that I was able to do that, to have this child, being responsible for it. She started working in childcare. She had a life back together, described it as a very happy period in her life where she feels very empowered. So she had, this is a quote she said, and it's like an example of the maturing out theory. She says, I just don't want to fall back into using again. I know that if I do, all that hard work would just be a waste. And I'm 32 now, I'm not getting any younger. I think if I start using again, it's going to take another 5 years away. And to tell you the truth, I sometimes do feel like using ice. It's always there. And I think it will always be there for me. That you have to just think of it in the long run. You have to think of the consequences. So she's really shifting to a more long-term perspective in her life and says, look, this is more beneficial for me than using drugs. So, but then a few years later, she has a relapse. And she describes having an eating disorder as well. And she was kind of getting insecure that after quitting the ice, she gained a lot of weight. She tried to lose that weight again, but then she thought, oh, now I look like a drug addict if I'm too skinny. So she was struggling with that. And in order to lose weight, she started using opiate and ice again. And her parents kicked her out of the house. And mostly people, like in the maturing out theory, they say, oh, there's one exception, people not maturing out, like two, poor socioeconomic backgrounds and psychological comorbidity. So is comorbidity a reason for her relapse? And she said, yeah, well, drugs plays a very important role in regulating my emotions and how I feel. And I felt really depressed and horrible about myself. So that made me relapse. I wanted to change the way I felt. So then she described having another turning point a few years later. So after her parents kicked her out, she got homeless. She didn't see her son for over a year. She started doing sex work to sustain her habit. And she described that she really hated it. She said, I'm a naturally shy person and to have to be on the streets and selling myself. It's a horrible experience. And she got hepatitis C, and she said, my body just crashed down. I thought this is not the life I want to live. I can't do this anymore. So she checked into methadone treatment. And then she met a very great psychiatrist who said, look, you have all this potential. Why don't you re-enroll at university? So she went to be a radiation therapist, a radiation professional. So she went back to university. And that was the first time, like when I interviewed her, we were at this point. So she was on methadone treatment, had a stable, stable substance. Like she didn't use anymore except for the treatment. She was really giving it a go at the university. Her contact with her family was good again. She saw her son again, building a relationship with him. She described like saving up for her own place to live so she could have her son over at her place. And she was doing really well. She described like still depression, panic attacks, paranoia, anxiety disorder, maybe borderline. But she had a lot of psychological support as well. And she says, oh, if something happens, I know where I can go, I can rebuild those strengths of dealing with my anxiety. So she was doing really well. And then a year later, I spoke to her and she had another relapse. And she described that she was at the final course of her study and she failed. And it was such a blow for her. She went out on the streets to buy heroin, got in a car with the wrong person, got assaulted, and just kind of gave up. And when I interviewed her, she was living on the streets again in pretty bad shape. And so like what made her relapse again? Well, she had her life back on order twice, and she really expressed that, look, really happy about getting this control back, seeing my son, having a good relationship with my family, studying. So you could say like maybe the brain disease model applies here, maybe still the craving or it keeps luring her in, and in weak moments she gives in and then she's back down again. And she said herself, like, I know I've made some really bad decisions in my life, and I actually sat there thinking, should I do this or should I do this? And I've actually chosen the wrong decision. I'm thinking like a drug addict. I know it's a wrong decision, but I can't stop myself. So you could say this is some evidence about how hard it is to stop drugs and the long-term effect on your brain. And even if you have your life together, you have that pull, that constant pull that you have to resist. And but then I look back at the interviews, and she also said some very interesting things about her sense of identity and how that played a role in the relapse. So that's more the loss of normative self-control. So you see that in some sense she regains control over her intentions, like through the medication, through the methadone. And then she's really working on her instrumental goals, and that's really working out. But the loss of normative self-control, that's really strong in her. So she's describing a few things. So on the one hand, like one of the things she said, I was sitting there in the college banks with all these posh people, and I come from a good background, so I can fit in. But I've been a sex worker on the street. And how does that how does that part of my identity fit in there? And what if people find out about me? And she said that sometimes when there was a conflict, she said I started like having that street behavior, like yelling at people. And then people said to me, yeah, that's really not how we interact in university. And also that she said she felt like an imposter, and she felt that people looked at her and could see that she was a sex worker, an addict, and all these negative things about her identity. And you really couldn't tell, like I couldn't tell, but she had this idea that people could see it when they looked at her, that this, and that's the concept of the body as a looking glass, that people can tell things by looking at you. And for some people with addiction, like addiction really marked them, and you can kind of see that they have been a heroin user or an alcoholic, but the insecurity that people might see it, that was already really destabilizing for her. And she kind of felt that she lost the ability to define her own identity, to kind of create, this is the person I want to be. I want to be this good mother. I want to be this good student. I want to be this good daughter. That it was somehow taken away from her. And she also kind of described the loss of belief in self-efficacy. Like, can I really make this life happen for me? Am I really worth that? And she said herself, like, it's like a self-sabotaging. It's really scary to succeed. Well, failure is something I know and everyone accepted me, but to succeed is a constant challenge and a constant being on the edge. So one of the things she said, you promise yourself that you never ever leave your son, if ever. And I'm just sick of making promises to myself and not following through. So when she kind of lost that last course for a study, instead of just picking herself up, it was for her, it was a sign that she was not worth that life. She was not worth the good life, and yeah, to succeed. So some quotes. I was very anxious during that year. Yeah, because I was worried about what other people are thinking about me. And being an addict, and I come from a good family, I can fit in that group if I want to, but I know that I'm an addict. I think that they can see it, I think we talked about that, and really they can't. But I've lost a lot of weight too, and I just felt like I looked like a drug addict. And she said, if you concentrate on failing, you're going to fail. And that's what I did. I just didn't have any belief in myself, unfortunately. And I think that everyone saw right through me. So, like, if you look at how she loses self-control, you see that it's all like there are the intentional elements, the instrumental elements, and that she mentioned to regain that, but that the normative is very, like the loss of herself and a feeling of self and control over defining her identity, that was the hardest part for her. And you see that they're both like internal and external factors. Like, and often there's a lot of focus on like willpower, and people with addiction, they have to just get themselves together, but it's really an interaction with the environment and expectations of the environment and the abilities to reach your goals. And you see how like the kind of existential, biographic and life circumstances influence her self-control. And she was one, like, she had a lot of things helping her, like a very supportive family with the means to help her. And still it was really hard. So like often, like in the example I told earlier about the smoker who had this hallelujah moment, like, I don't want to be this kind of person. Often in theories about identity, they focus on that, like, oh, but if you kind of have this, oh, I don't want to be that kind of person, everything will turn out all right. But what I saw in my study, that like a lot of people started very young with substance use in their adolescence, and it's also a period where your identity is formed by doing all kinds of things. And if you only used substances in a period, you have very little identity materials to rebuild your life from when you're like turning in your 30s and you're maturing out. And like both addiction and psychiatric disorders disrupt that identity formation. So a lot of people don't have a very strong sense of self. And it's further, the sense of self is eroded also by stigma in society, by stigma among medical professionals. And also kind of, if you're constantly exhausted and battling that craving and your life on the streets, it's also very hard to gain a more long-term perspective and a more normative view on your life. You're just surviving. So these are all kind of factors that make it very hard to rebuild that identity and to exercise self-control from the self. But mostly if people are further in their recovery trajectory, I think it's a very important point to address, like how it's a feeling of self and self-efficacy. So these are quotes from like the other interviews, and that one person said, oh, we're just very normal persons living very complicated lives. And I think that's also in Hannah's paper a lot, like most people writing about addiction, they kind of take their own situation as a starting point. How do I handle challenges and self-control? But most people with like long-term addictions, they have very complicated lives with a lot of factors that influence their choices and the choices that are available to them. And this is a quote of someone else, and he said, sometimes I go outside and I feel really hated. I thought it must be how I dress or the expression on my face or something. You just constantly feel like you have a big neon sign on your head saying loser, you know, contemptible loser. So when someone actually in a shop or something, they actually smile at you or act like you're a normal human being, it's really restorative. It cheers me up for days. I get to control what everyday life is, I suppose. It's just a lonely kind of control, because it's control based in publicly adding myself as a freak. But you know, it's a kind of control, I suppose. So this also shows kind of the social interaction and the option available, and also the options for forming your identity. So, and this other respondent, he said, we all want to be part of something positive, but our lack of belief in self is what can cause negative, impactful choices. And he described, like, that he'd been in rehab numerous times. And he said, every time I'm in rehab, I come out with new tools and new strategies, but I never used them because I didn't believe it had any sense or it would result in a good outcome. And then suddenly he had this awakening moment and he thought, yeah, I'm gonna try it. And then he said, I had all these tools, I just never used them. But once I started to believe in myself, I started to use those tools. So, and maybe the other quote. Yeah, that's from another study of Hughes. And he said, like, I really like this quote. Like the interviewer asked someone, like, what was your turning point in recovery? And the guy says, I think it was treating you with a lot of compassion and a lot of understanding, and treating you like a fucking human being, not like a criminal or a fucking drug addict. To give you hope that there's a fucking life after heroin. I think it were my key worker and staff constantly telling me that there's hope, you're too good for that fucking shit, you know? There's a fucking life out there for you if you want it. Which in 10 years of heroin, no one's ever told me. And when I read that quote, I thought, yeah, like I interviewed a lot of people. If you have someone opposite of you and you hear every year the same depressing story about being homeless and all the challenges and the violence, and it doesn't occur to you to say, look, there's a good life for you out there. You just think, yeah, it sucks. But if no one tells you that in like years, how are you going to believe in yourself and believe in your self-efficacy and believe that there's a better life out there? So the recovery, like, that there isn't one way to kind of, there's not one way for everyone the best. And the recovery can happen both bottom up, top down, simultaneously. And most current treatments already address those levels of self-control. But if you really look at the 3 layers, I think that's the most important thing, and not think too quickly, because maybe with the case study I said, they thought too quickly, well, like she has control over substance use, she's back in college, she's reaching her goals, that's enough. And they kind of ignored her identity and her feeling of self. So it's always important to have, like, as a final test, is normative self-control secured enough? But also to realize the importance of other people, like health professionals, but also family members, passing by, to look and to help people and to support them in trying to regain their valued life and identity. So that was the image again. So, and I think this picture kind of nicely illustrated that in a way you have to warm yourself with some kind of hope that you create yourself, and to inspire yourself, and to kind of, yeah, maybe fake it till you make it. Yeah, so maybe so to assess to what extent someone with an addiction has lost self-control, I think it's really helpful to distinguish between the different levels of self-control. And I think most theories kind of say a lot about these levels, but it's important to distinguish them, but also see how they connect each other, how they can strengthen each other or erode each other. And in most cases, addiction is a complex multi-level failure of self-control. And professionals and researchers should acknowledge the autobiographical, existential context in which addicted people have to exercise their agency. And addiction is not only changes the brain of addicted people, but also their bodies, their social relationships, their self-understanding, their belief in self-efficacy. That's it.
Before we just take a 1 or 2 minute break to gather our thoughts, have a drink if you want to, and then we'll move to Q&A. Oh yeah,
Stop. Yeah, get my notes.
Moving on.
Yes.
Okay, so as before, same old hand finger system, and if you keep your hand up until I sort of see you and give you a nod, then I'll hand you start at the top.
Thank you. I'm not quite exactly sure the best way to phrase the question, but I think that your final statement about asking whether normative self-control has been secured is something very interesting and important. But one way of securing normative self-control is to say, I want to be someone who drinks myself to death. And I'm thinking like Nicolas Cage in Leaving Las Vegas. And it's quite an unusual way to go to be that explicit, but some people do. and I had a patient like this very recently. And in some ways, there's something that seems, in a way, positive about someone acting in a way that is in accordance with their normative ideals of self-control, but it also feels like something's gone wrong there. And I wondered if you had any thoughts on that or how to respond to that, really.
Yeah. So the question is if someone wants to drink themselves to death, whether that's normative self-control or something.
But if
wrong.
someone very explicitly, not in terms of I have these multiple conflicting values and this is something that I'm struggling to disentangle, because that's one thing, but someone wholeheartedly embraces it and says, I want to drink myself to death. That is my goal. I want to spend my however long it takes drinking, and then I'll die.
Yeah, like I think the nice thing we did in the research with the timeline is that if you look back at like pre-addiction and you ask people what did you want to do in life, then drinking myself to death is often not, is never mentioned, or being a drug addict. Yeah, it's a question whether that's normative self-control or not, and whether you, yeah, whether it's people feel like it's the only option available to them, and whether that's true or not. And I think it has to be on a case-to-case basis whether that's the best or only available option to people, or whether they just don't see how the other steps are available to them. And I think in the Netherlands, since 2 years, they started this trial whether euthanasia for chronic addicts that have no prospect of recovery is available. And yeah, so some people requested euthanasia for their long-term addiction and got it in the Netherlands as an alternative to have yourself drink to that. And some of those people were quite young. Yeah.
Thank you. So Anke, first of all, that was wonderful, and the qualitative work and analysis you've done is just such a really important contribution, and I've learned so much from it. And with that caveat, though, I want to ask a really big scale question about the framing of it in terms of self-control, because I agree with everything you say. It has hugely informed my work. But I feel like what you're doing is not giving an account of self-control, but showing us why that has been a terrible mistake in terms of the basic construct by which addiction is framed. Because I think when we think about self-control, we think about there being an impulse which fundamentally people have to resist. And that's the entire setup of self-control. There's this thing, you have to not do it if someone can't do it for themselves, and maybe society steps in and stops them from doing it, right, one way or another. But so much of the work you've done is explored the nuance of the value of providing people with alternatives from a human perspective, which is exactly the kind of thing we know helps in animal models, right? So in ways, the question is, why not frame this not as a theory of loss of self-control, but a theory of the fundamental importance of better choices and options, whether that's for an animal in a cage or a human on the streets, which just seems to me to really reframe some of the conclusions you really rightly want to draw. Why self-control?
Can you repeat it one more time, your question? I missed some.
So I guess what I think the picture you paint is true and so important. And I feel like it's a corrective to so much that is wrong with how people theorize and think about addiction. But I think of it as a corrective to a false emphasis on self-control, which is something you're still maintaining as a label for what you're offering.
Mm.
So what I think you show is that self-control isn't the right framing. The right framing is something like the fundamental importance of alternative choices and goods to drugs. That's what the trick is. And I don't think of that as the same as self-control.
Yeah, I think yeah. Yeah, it's so I think I kind of, it's also kind of a semantic thing, I think, between Dutch philosophy, English philosophy, and like which language do you use? So I think like the strong focus on in traditional self-control theories on autonomy and on rational decision making, that got kind of broadened with more relational autonomy kind of views and more environmental theories. Yeah, you could say that maybe it takes away from a strict concept of self-control, but I think it depends on what school of self-control you're into. But I will think about it. It's an interesting point.
Did you pass the mic back behind you to comment?
So when you showed the slide of how your three models interact, my question is, why is the normative on top? Shouldn't that be the most basic one, the one where you really start and saying you are actually to the patient or client or the addict, whatever you want to call them, you are a human being. You have this identity as a drug addict, but this is where you really start. So that should be, I'm asking, why isn't that the bottom level? And connected to that, you said, well, when you showed that picture with the painted fire, you said it's a hope you create yourself. But isn't the quote you gave before that there is a life out there for you if you just want it, showing that you can't do it yourself? It's other people who have to show you what you're worth, basically. Show you the most basic normative identity is being an addict is not who you really are, or you're called to this, or whatever you want to frame it, to something else, to something higher, better, more noble, more happy, whatever. So these are the two questions.
Yeah, so like with the pyramid, I actually thought a lot about that. Like, does it need to be a circle or an onion, or like and like it makes me think of the pyramid of Maslow, where they also say, oh, you have to start with like the safety, security, food, shelter, and then self-employment and identity, and that, or like self-fulfillment and identity, and that the recent shift is now we have to turn it around and it start with acknowledging the other person as a human being. And a lot of homeless people say that as well, like being invisible to other people is worse than being hungry. And once someone sees me, I feel like I count again. So there could be arguments for shifting it around and to first see someone and acknowledge their being a human. Yeah. So it's just a choice. But yeah, it's an interesting point. Yeah, well, and the second question again was?
The second is, if you said at some point that it's the hope you give yourself, but if you're in that hole, so to say, you can't do that. So you need, and it's what this last quote, second to last quote said, that you need somebody to tell you, in 10 years, I haven't heard that there is a life out there. Nobody told me. So you need people to tell you. I don't think you can make it yourself. That's the question. Where does the hope come from?
Yeah, I think it can, yeah, you probably need both. You need that imagination of yourself and the connection with your core, like I can do it, and it really helps if or it can, like some people describe the turning point like was an awakening point when they were by themselves and they could suddenly see that fire burning. And other people described it as a turning point when something the kid said or their mother said or someone else said, and that, or the social worker said, and that was a turning point. So it's probably both, or like for some people it's one entrance and for the other.
And do you have a question? Yeah, I missed your hand.
Thank you very much, Anke. You know how much I admire your work from when you started it and your dissertation. So my question is related to what other people said. We're asking. It is just for your reflection. So the first case, you helped me understand one explanation of maturing out that I want to. So one idea, like the story that you started with about the man dropping off the kids and then the cigarette. Or other people who mature out, the common sort of story is they realized that things were not going well in terms of their normative ideals and they were in danger of losing some things. So I just wanted to ask you, that seems right. But what happens sometimes with lots of addicts, or at least the ones that are the most worrisome, is like with your first informant, Nicole, was that her name? Yeah. They've lost everything. And depending on the sort of cultural support, there actually isn't a children to go back to, or a spouse to go back to, a home to go back to, or a job to go back to. So I guess the question is, what do we do to sort of make possibilities, make a possibility of hope realistic for people? I mean, it seems like it can't be individual work. It has to be sort of societal work of some sort, right? Because I mean, I've seen people like this, of course, who get sober, but they really have to deal with the fact that they're not going to get back any of the things that were existentially most important to them.
Yeah, that's a hard question. Yeah, and you often heard that people say, look, I'm clean now, but yeah, I only have Netflix and don't have any friends, and the only thing I do is watch TV. And I'm disabled, and like I'm physically a wreck, and no friends left, no family, and yeah, but a lot of people of now, like, yeah, sometimes they had like little steps that they said, oh, I found out I enjoyed cooking. I never cooked a meal in my life, and now I have like these herbs in my kitchen, and I try to explore that, or like with music, or like watching TV for the rest of your life. Yeah. But like one of the things I found striking is that, so most of the people I interviewed were from poor socioeconomic backgrounds, but in some ways, people from high economic backgrounds struggled more because they relatively lost more. Because they said, look, my siblings are traveling the world and owning 2 houses, and I could have had that. And they're objectively better off than some of the people from the low socioeconomic backgrounds, but their family never expected anything of them. So that they're on the dole and that they're doing nothing with their lives is less of a failure than for someone from a high economic background. Yeah.
We have a question from somebody in the chat. I can't see up there, so I'll read out from here. Your research is fascinating. I really loved your approach, the philosophically informed qualitative research and use of findings to build a clinically relevant theory. Could you say something more about your methodology and whether there was any tension between philosophical and empirical approaches?
That's an interesting one. Like one of the things that we really had to thought about is to not directly test philosophical theories on the respondents, but to really try to map out their life stories and their experiences and their lived experience. Because we had these questions like, do you think addiction is a disease or not? Or can you tell me about a moral dilemma? And it hardly gave any substantial data. You get very flat answers that weren't really nice to empirically study. But so we started with this, tell me a bit about how you came where you are today, what happened in your life, the good things, the bad things, what kind of person are you? But also like what happened in your life the last years, what kind of things that happened to you that really helped to link that to the more philosophical theories instead of asking them directly about, do you think you lost intentional or instrumental self-control? So, but it was a bit challenging as well to kind of reconnect the empirical approaches to the philosophical approaches, especially with some analytical philosophers that seem to be so far away from like what people with addiction are really experiencing, and that see it as some kind of a test case of an alien with no control. And that, yeah. So that was you really had to kind of shift off the more theoretical stuff and really listen to what people experienced and how their life looked like and what they hoped for. Yeah.
I had a question of my own, which might be somewhat related to what you said in response to Conrad's first question, I think, on the hierarchy. In particular, I was thinking about where habits might fit into the picture. Where over the long term, you might form habits in yourself, or cultivate habits on the basis of, or somehow that sounds kind of like a kind of normative self-control, which is definitely a type of habit. But when they're instantiated in the things you do, they might bypass your instrumental reasoning or self-control and even your intentional self-control in the kind of short term. And on one interpretation of the hierarchy, that's maybe a counterexample. On that interpretation, like you can only have the top if you've got the bottom ones, and you lose the top or something. But maybe that's just not what the hierarchy is. So I was just wondering how something like long-term habit formation, non-intentional actions in the short term, might fit into it.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And what I saw and what I found quite different from my life is that if you have like a very long-term addiction, the only habits you have left revolve around scoring and or drinking, and like, so they really, when they're in recovery, they really have to relearn, when do I eat? When do I sleep? When do I do grocery shopping? When do I put the garbage outside? So all these things that we never think about, that don't cost us any energy to kind of do. Like you just get up, you take a shower, you brush your teeth, you get dressed. You don't think about it. And they really had to, some people really had to relearn how to live from like all the basic steps. Like, what do I eat? What do I drink if I don't drink alcohol? So every little step that for us is, yeah, don't cost us any energy. They really had to figure that out by themselves. And some people said, well, and growing up, I never learned this either. So I really have no clue how to do this. And that first stage costs so much energy that there's basically no room for anything else than just establishing the normal routines, eating and sleeping that we all have. So that's, yeah, I think that needs to be addressed. And maybe that's what's with the pyramid, like you need to address that first, sometimes before someone can even think about long-term goals, before they can even think about their valued life. They just have to figure out first how to eat and sleep and be a normal human being and not being bored out of their mind. Yeah.
So on that picture would be the things that we might do as habits. Somebody might have to instead do intentionally.
Yeah, they really have to rebuild their habits. For some people, not everyone, but like yeah.
We probably have time for one more question. Welcome to the field, has any last question before we go to Sean. Yeah.
Hi, that was great. I really enjoyed that. I had a question. The self-image seems fundamental in what we're going with, and Owen spoke about it yesterday. In like, like Flanagans are drinkers, like the image of the Flanagan you are is kind of doing that. And if we take it that the image is very, very important for recovery, and the self-image is, I'm just kind of wondering, like, how? Is it because having a self-image of yourself as an alternative identity, this non-addict, the fake it till you make it, does it give like an explanatory power that you could be something else? Does it give a motivational thing? Is it like, is it a kind of inspiration of hope that does something? Is it all of these? I'm just wondering about the mechanics of the image, because I find that identity image fascinating and really important, but I can't latch on to how it's doing what it's doing.
How identity is doing what it's doing? you mean?
How the belief in the self-image can, how it moves the addict towards somewhere else.
Yeah, so if you look a bit broader at the identity theories, they say that like we all have kind of different identities simultaneously. So when you enter a shop, you have like the identity of a customer and you behave like that. So they're like, we have many scripts connected to our sense of identity and also to which identity is in the front. So whether you're with your friends or with your partner, it's probably a different type of behavior you show. And there's some consistency, but they're really scripts attached. So it has a motivation, of course, just to think, just to kind of put that identity in front. Is that an answer to your question, or?
Yeah, that's a great answer.
Okay, that's pretty much time. So
I did bring some of my theses. I don't have enough for anyone, but like the three, if you want a thesis.
well, even more reason to say thank you.